Why did you come here?
Because I tried to commit.
Hello, YouTube. It's time for a psychology session. I've noticed recently that psychology is not really doing a whole lot of good for the world. I know, hot take, right? And I found this interesting article that kind of goes into what the problems with psychology are and the detrimental effect that it's having on young people. It's titled, "Psychiatry is Vexing Americans and Subverting Freedom." And it's on the Libertarian Institute. I'm not a libertarian by any means, but I did find a lot of points in this article pretty dang good. Psychiatry is ruining more lives than ever before. The New York Times recently showcased psychiatric prevalence inflation, a vast increase in reported mental illness among teenagers because they are encouraged to view normal symptoms as grave maladies requiring intervention. Oxford University psychologist Lucy Folk observed that school programs are, quote, creating this message that teenagers are vulnerable, they're likely to have problems, and the solution is to outsource them to a professional. In an analysis published last year in the academic journal New Ideas in Psychology, Folk explained that awareness efforts spur young people to interpret and report milder forms of distress as mental health problems. Filing such complaints leads some individuals to experience a genuine increase in symptoms, because labeling a distress as a mental health problem can affect an individual's self-concept and behavior in a way that is ultimately self-fulfilling. There's been a huge prevalence of students being diagnosed with mental illnesses because we've sort of broadened the idea of what constitutes a mental illness. And really, when it comes down to it, mental illness is, for the most part, obviously there's extreme cases. For the most part, it's a discomfort in one's life, whether that be through external things, internal things, it doesn't really matter. It's all rooted in this idea that life is not going as it should be, or you are not who you should be. And a lot of these mental illnesses, especially in this younger generation, are rooted in the fact that this whole age gap from 14 to, I want to say, up to like 21, it's a big transition period. And here in the United States, at least, people are kicked out of their house by some parents at age 18. We're expecting kids from a public education environment who were asking to go to the bathroom, as the meme goes, to all of a sudden needing to pick a career. And it's pretty obvious that putting that kind of pressure on an 18-year-old is going to have a detrimental effect on their mental wellness. Because, I mean, if we had all turned out the way we thought we were going to be when we were 18, our futures would be very different from where they are now. We're taking this transitory stage and we're branding these students, these young people, as mentally ill for the rest of their life. And once you tell someone that they're depressed, and you compound that by putting them on a bunch of medications, as is usually the case, it just creates this, what the article says, self-fulfilling prophecy, where the student or the person is now a depressed person. And, oh, well, I guess I'm going to be that way for life. Psychiatric diagnoses have become status symbols, propelled by snake oil social-emotional learning programs. University of Southern California clinical psychologist Darby Saxby warns that mental illness labels have, quote, become an identity marker that makes people feel special and unique. That's a big problem, because this modern idea that anxiety is an identity gives people a fixed mindset, telling them this is who they are and who they will be in the future. Psychiatric labels can disable the people they seek to assist. The New York Times found that many young people were left worse off thanks to mental health interventions. Endless classroom presentations on mental health spur co-rumination, excessively talking about one's problems, which might remind many people of first dates from hell. And that's where I think it's important that we call into question the efficacy of talk therapy. Sure, it's good to kind of expose what may have happened to you in your childhood, whether it be trauma, generalized anxiety, issues at home, maybe a divorce, and you can talk about ways to manage that stress. But in the end, that person is going to have to take action for themselves. Sitting and talking about it constantly, well, that's just going to lead to the person being even more depressed, right? It's why things like 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, well, I do think there are benefit for some people who need that group setting where they can kind of just vent about their week, or, that being held accountable by a certain program. Sitting and talking about alcoholism, it just makes you want to drink, right? If you can't think about anything but I'm an alcoholic, this is who I'm always going to be, I can't get better, well, then you've fixed yourself as that person, and you've denied yourself the opportunity to actually seek ways to either remedy your addiction or mental illness, or find healthy ways to introduce alcohol into your life. Now, I'm not naive. I think most people probably can't handle alcohol or any form of narcotic drug, weed included, because it's very addictive by nature. And you can cope and seethe and dilate and think that you've got it all under control. But most people, if they're being honest with themselves, their lives would improve vastly if they didn't have to pay the Pied Piper through substance abuse. A deluge of new mental illnesses is helping to hobble an entire young generation. Hungarian-American psychiatrist Thomas Zaz warned in the last century, quote, "Psychiatrists manufacture mental diagnoses the way the Vatican manufactures saints," but Zaz's deft ridicule did nothing to prevent a sham stampede. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, and that's pretty much what everybody calls it, now lists more than 300 mental illnesses, 5 times as many as it specified in the 1960s. Dr. Alan Francis, writing in Psychology Today, warned that the latest DSM contained, quote, "many changes that seem clearly unsafe and scientifically unsound, and is likely to lead to massive overdiagnosis and harmful over-medication." And that's really the issue, especially here in America. I don't know how it might be in other countries, but when you go to a psychologist or you go to a general practitioner and you say, I'm depressed, 99% of the time he's going to put you on an SSRI or some kind of benzo, and that's going to be it, right? And then that is just going to create this loop of, well, this one isn't really working. Well, let's try this one. Let's up your dose here. Oh, well, I don't like the side effects, so let's add this medication, and so on and so forth. And then you essentially turn into some kind of zombie with a bunch of side effects, and those side effects make you more depressed, and then, you end up taking the Klebold way out, as it were. After the DSM redefined autism in the 1990s, the autism rate quickly multiplied almost 100-fold. Thanks to another DSM redefinition, the number of American children and adolescents treated for bipolar disorder increased 40-fold. Between 1993 and 2004, the New York Times reported, psychiatrist Laurent Matrin complained in 2023 that the latest version of the DSM is so full of vague and trivial definitions and ambiguous language that ensures more people will fall into various abnormal categories. Between 2008 and 2019, the number of undergraduate students diagnosed with anxiety increased by 134%, 106% for depression, 57% for bipolar disorder, 72% for ADHD, 67% for schizophrenia, and 100% for anorexia, according to the National College Health Assessment. Students' struggles skyrocketed after COVID shutdowns, and I don't want to downplay that at all. What happened to especially those high school age kids it's unforgivable by those who were really pushing lockdowns and keeping students out of school and forcing them to wear masks, and the ostracization that a lot of them face socially. And I remember even hearing about the KYS rate just going huge. Like, I remember watching a video of some kid that did himself in with a belt in his closet because he just couldn't cope with the social isolation. And so I don't want to downplay that. I do think that a lot of younger kids are going into this world that is just completely foreign to them. It's foreign to us older adults as well. So imagine being 18 And all of a sudden, not only do you have to find out what it is that you need to do for the rest of your life, as most of us find out, but you're also having to deal with a world where you never learn those proper social skills, or you're academically behind because you essentially missed 2 years of school, because everyone knows online schooling is a joke in terms of public education. A Boston University analysis of students on almost 400 campuses in 2022 found that 60% of the respondents met the qualifying criteria for one or more mental health problems, a nearly 50% increase from 2013. But awarding endless psychiatric Purple Hearts to college students will do nothing to help graduates adjust to the challenges of daily life beyond the classroom. I recognized that the APA had gone nuts after attending their 1986 annual meeting in Washington. Here are some riffs from a Detroit news piece I wrote at the time. The APA served attendees a batch of freshly ordained mental illnesses, including premenstrual dysphoric disorder. The APA says symptoms of this mental illness include irritability, marked fatigue, and negative evaluation of self. According to the APA's definition, a third of all women go crazy once a month. And, there is some truth in that, right? I am happily married, and for 1 week out of each month, I am unhappily married. Not trying to paint a bleaker picture than it is. I'm obviously being pedantic, but really, women especially. And the problem is we live in a society where a woman is not really allowed to just be menstrual, because a lot of them are working, right? A lot of them are having to deal with and cope with the stress of a work life, while also their body is essentially just acting crazy and hormonal, right? But to give it a classification as a mental illness, that doesn't really help things, right? The second newly ordained mental illness is self-defeating personality type, previously known as common or garden variety masochism. The symptoms for this grade disorder include complaints, directly or indirectly, about being unappreciated, repeatedly turns down opportunities for pleasure, and remains in relationships in which others take advantage of him or her. Bring on the Valium. That's crazy, right? Self-defeating personality type. People are born, everyone is unique. Everyone has their own inclinations, and it's all shaped by your genetics, obviously, especially like epigenetics, but also how are you raised, right? Did you have an abusive father? Did you get screamed at a lot? Were you verbally abused and put down? Well, guess what? That's going to play into how you view yourself. But what are you going to do? Are you going to be labeled with a self-defeating personality type, and then what? Are you going to take drugs? What are you going to do about your situation? Are you just going to say, well, this is me. Come over. I'm going to bend over and take everything that you want to do to me. Not healthy. We have new mental illnesses not because of new breakthroughs in understanding the mind, but because psychiatrists want more money and more power over the rest of us. Shrinks generally have a poor batting average for curing known mental problems, but that has not stopped them from creating new illnesses that supposedly they alone can treat. But a con artist with an MD is still a con artist. In 2019, the APA officially designated traditional masculinity as a de facto mental illness. Their new guidelines specifically state that stoicism and other traits on the whole harmful. Did that make Marcus Aurelius spin in his grave? Apparently, instead of toughing out challenges, people are supposed to spend their lives whimpering to shrinks and getting appropriately drugged. That's really the crux of this article, right? And you'll have to excuse me because I am a man, so I don't want to mansplain this to women, but I'm going to anyways. Talking about your problems endlessly is a very womanly thing. I'm sorry. If you go and gossip with the girls, man, well, she said this, and that, and you should, bro, whenever someone comes to my house and starts talking to my wife, or I see my wife talking with their family, it's all just gossip. Or they just talk about the problems they've got. That's all they do. Think about this. The last time I went and hung out with my bros, and I say bros, they are literally my brothers, I don't think we talked about our mental problems at all. You know what we talked about? How weird society is getting. How to become self-sufficient. We just made jokes and memes about history. We just talked about good old times. The way men communicate with one another is very different. to how women communicate with one another. And I know I work with a bunch of women all day, and I have for most of my life, unfortunately, or fortunately. And women use talking as a means of working through issues, solving problems. And most men, we don't want to do that. We just want to get to it. We'll try and solve the problem on our own, whether it be some kind of manual labor thing or it be some kind of office task or programming thing. We'll do it, we'll try our best, and then we'll reach out for help, get it corrected, and so on. But whereas women, they like to talk through the process. They like to be super organized. They like a bunch of folders and lists and ways that we can improve this. And in the workforce, you can see the differences. And I myself see the differences working alongside a lot of women. We think through things very differently. We communicate very differently. Emails that I receive from women are probably 3 or 4 sentences longer than they need to be. Emails I send are, at tops, 5 sentences long. And that's 1 sentence saying hello, 3 sentences explaining the problem and what to do, and 1 sentence ending the email. If I can't explain it in less than that, then I'm going to have to call you, unfortunately. And there's nothing wrong with that, but women are much more community-minded. Men, we like to do things on our own. We like to figure things out. We like to see how the world works, right? Both are fine. Both have their place. Psychiatrists have helped some individuals better understand themselves and deal more deftly with everyday life. But bogus mental illnesses have turned millions of healthy Americans into mental patients, according to Dr. Alan Francis. That debacle explains why Thomas Szasz crusaded against the therapeutic state and the medicalization of everyday life. And you can see this along with just standard American medicine too, right? Diabetes, you get diabetes. What does your doctor do? Gives you a bunch of drugs. When most of your problems, especially if you're in a pre-diabetic stage, can be fixed by just cleaning up your diet and not eating so much refined sugar and carbs, right? But there's no money to be made in that, unfortunately. All of the money is made in expensive surgeries, expensive pharmaceutical drugs, and even though most mental drugs are relatively cheap generically nowadays, they're still trying to push, like let's say you go in and you have ADHD and you get a prescription to essentially Adderall. Yeah, you can get the generic one, but it's not going to be cheap. So there's no money to be made in just promoting a healthy lifestyle, unfortunately. And this is both in the field of quote-unquote mental illness and just normal medicine. But this peril also profoundly endangers freedom. The profusion of new diagnostic labels encourages people to view themselves as psychologically fragile. Actually, the Americans with Disability Act tacitly rewards people who demand reasonable accommodations because they are depressed or anxious. Those incentives create a downward political psychological spiral. Besides, if you're reading this website, you're at risk of being designated, i.e. found guilty, of DSM category 313.81, oppositional defiant disorder. One telltale trait of that mental illness is they often argue with authority figures. Guilty as charged. Therapists are hollowing out the American character generation by generation. What do those wizards offer in lieu of the stoicism they derided? Politicians race to fill the void with their usual toxic. A century ago, H.L. Mencken observed, the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. And the more fearful people become, the more gullible they will be. British philosopher John Stuart Mill warned in 1842, persons of timid character are the most predisposed to believe any statement, the more it is calculated to alarm them. In a democracy, as long as enough people can be frightened, almost everyone can be subjugated. And just to wrap all of this up, I wanted to bring to light a study that I had read where they took a bunch of psychologists, I think it was 5 psychologists, they took 5 people with a master's degree in English, and then they each had those people visit with various individuals and sort of do a form of talk therapy. So the psychologists did talk therapy with their patients. The people with an English degree did quote-unquote talk therapy with their assigned patients. And what was the outcome of that study? People with an English degree were just as able as people with a psychology degree to talk to these people and kind of get them to open up and understand and talk about the issues they were having. Why? Because if you have an English degree, you have a vocabulary where you're able to explain things much more broadly. You know, people might come into a psychologist's office and say, well, I feel bad. Well, what does bad mean? Well, I feel sad. Well, what does sad mean to you? And it's going to take a long time for them to open up. Someone that has a more verbose vocabulary is able to kind of target the other person. They can bring out things they might not have been able to bring out because they understand and command the English language. For better or for worse, all of us use language, whether it's our internal monologues, which I hope all of you listening to this video have. If you don't, I'm sorry. You think through your life and you think in words. Everything is rooted in words. Our reality is then essentially shaped by the way that we communicate with the outside world, whether that's mentally or verbally, whether it's from interpersonal communication, whether it's what we see on TV. Everything is linguistic, right? So don't downplay that. And what that study actually concluded was it was more important the background of the person rather than their sort of ability to psychoanalyze and here's this theory of this and this theory of this. What was more important was that the person that they were talking to was actually relatable, and the person that was being, the patient was actually able to feel that the person they were talking to had a similar background and they kind of understood where they were coming from. And so let's say you leave my office here and you walk down the street to Cocoa Hills Mental Health Clinic. You walk in and you say, I need an appointment. Oh, we have an availability. This person just canceled. So here's our psychologist, Dr. Judy Taub. And you walk in and you sit down on the blue chair and you look across from you and it's a morbidly obese woman with bleached blue hair, nasty like fox eye glasses. Are you following me here? And on her wall is just a bunch of weird alphabet stuff. And she framed a Tumblr post. Do you actually think that you're going to get anything of benefit from this person? If you're anything like me, I wouldn't want to talk to that person, let alone open up to them about my problems, because they're not going to understand what I'm talking about. They're not going to understand the absolute chudness, right? I need to speak with fellow chuds. Maybe we should start a chud psychology clinic, and we will obviously not have any licenses and we're going to get shut down, but chud psychology. You heard it here first. Robin Williams. Think about it. What did Robin Williams do in Good Will Hunting? He tried to meet Matt Damon where he was, and then he gave him a hug and said, it's not your fault, right? If Robin Williams had been my psychologist, I don't know if I would have been able to get much from him, because him and I don't have a lot in common. Although I did like Flubber, right? Everyone knows Robin Williams' best movie was Flubber. Anyways, right? So we've critiqued psychology from a standpoint of what it's doing to society and how having all of these diagnoses is not actually helping people, it's making them worse. What about the roots of psychology? And there's this article on Modern Psychologists. This website has been inactive since 2019, but it's a guy, and he has a background in psychology. I believe he has a master's. And he just goes through the problems with the approach, the modern psychological approach. In this article, Modern Psychology, Illusions and Dogma. Pick any university in the world, and you will almost certainly find that the undergraduate program with the highest enrollment is psychology, and it's mostly women, as most of higher education is nowadays. Psychology programs offer a major source of university funding, yet few students will ever continue on to graduate school or use their degrees in any direct way. There is something about psychology that provides an unquestionable draw. We all desire to have a better understanding of ourselves, other people, and the social worlds that we inhabit. It is this hunger for self-understanding that drives the enrollment at universities and the sales of self-help books and pop psychology texts in local bookstores. The audience is clearly there, but what are we giving them? I tend to have something of a love-hate relationship with my chosen field and profession. On the one hand, psychology claims the noble aspiration of wanting to better understand what it is to be human, how people think, feel, and act. It has the potential to use this knowledge in ways to develop insight and awareness about ourselves and others, to heal people through self-discovery, to help people live more vibrantly and with a greater sense of meaning, purpose, and with psychological equanimity. Applied on the socio-cultural scale, it could be used to help uncover and explore psychological motives that play a role in the persistence of unhealthy delusions, such as those that cause us to repress awareness of imminent environmental threats to our human existence. Boo, climate change, but let's talk more about toxic environments, right? Those that cause us to rationally justify terror and war, or those that cause us to treat individuals from different cultural worldviews. In short, psychology, if it were utilized appropriately and to its fullest potential, could help us create a better world for ourselves and for future generations. However, it seems to me that mainstream psychology fails to measure up to its potential. For me, it continues to disappoint. Let me briefly outline my position. He goes on to critique psychology because psychology says it's a science, right? However, he talks about how psychology is really just an empirical way of looking at people, right? You can't see thoughts or emotions. You can't see intentions. All you can get is what people tell you. And if we're being honest, most people, unless they're just in a deathbed confession to a priest, I guess, they're not going to be completely honest, or they're going to kind of field their words in a way that is not going to be completely indicative of what their situation is. And then that evidence that's provided through talk therapy and sessions is then gone through various theories. And these theories are not set in stone. These aren't like scientific theories. These aren't like physics theories. It's not like whatever Newton was learning. So the evidence from psychological research is only as good as our theories, which, unlike those in physics, chemistry, and mathematics, change all the time. We are bred into our conceptual communities or theoretical worldviews, much like we were taught to think about religion or politics. We joined with like-minded individuals who think like we do, talk like we do, and reason like we do. We rationalize those with opposing views as uninteresting, unimportant, or ignorant. So our theoretical worldviews will be shaped by the universities we attend, the professors we are exposed to, and the books we read, the jargon we are taught to use, and so on. Once we subscribe to a conceptual community, thinking becomes narrowed, and it becomes extremely difficult to critique or challenge our assumptions or to communicate with others who think differently. A cognitive behaviorist, for example, will seldom see eye to eye with a psychodynamic theorist. Remember that if the data was indeed objective, we would not have such disagreements about its interpretation or its relevance. But in the social sciences, such disagreements happen all the time, and the reason is because the data is always interpreted through our preferred theoretical lens. Once we become enraptured by a particular theoretical paradigm, it's hard to see our favored view as fallible, or to see other theories as capable of offering a credible alternative. And really, guys, and girls, if anyone's watching this that is of the other gender, you can be a psychologist. Believe it or not, when you go and sit down with the psychologist that you're paying a lot of money to talk to, I mean, that's how you know they're good friends, is you have to pay them, right? They're just bringing their worldview and they're going to try and put it into you, right? Just like what I'm doing now. My worldview is psychology is pretty much useless except for the most extreme cases, and I am purveying my point of view onto you, just like any good psychologist would. But you can be this, and in conversations with anybody, you're doing this, right? And you group yourselves with people that think alike. I mean, what a shocking concept. So is there really any benefit, even if you're going to a psychologist that has a similar worldview, is there any benefit to it? I mean, maybe he can see some insight because he's coming from your perspective, but he's also just going to kind of, in a way, tell you what you want to hear. Early in the development of this field, a small group of individuals got together to discuss education and training requirements as it related to clinical practice and the profession of psychology. The Boulder Conference effectively decided upon a scientist-practitioner model, implicitly suggesting that good scientists ought to make for good clinicians, leaving aside the aforementioned question about whether psychology can even produce a true scientist. This seems to be a dubious position whose underlying assumptions have been severely critiqued in recent decades. Why should a good scientist possess clinical skills? How can that help them better understand the subjective realities of their clients? What does a scientific psychology even mean? With that, I would even go so far as to argue that modern-day psychologists are perhaps worse clinicians than those of previous generations. How can that be? Have we not progressed in our scientific knowledge? Don't we know so much more than we did in decades prior? In many ways we have, but I think we have forgotten an awful lot as well. Since we think we are doing some kind of progressive science, we tend to minimize the necessity of reading about any of the great thinkers in our field: William James, Sigmund Freud, Otto Rank, Ernest Becker, and others. Our continuing belief that psychology can be a scientific discipline akin to chemistry or physics has arguably influenced the way we view our therapy clients as well. The self-conscious, subjective experience of the unique human being and the underlying causes of said experiences take a backseat to our focus on crude categorizations based on a particular cluster of symptoms. We implicitly subscribe to the medical model of mental illness, where clusters of symptoms and their convenient labels are then treated as real physical things, much like liver cancer or herpes. The subjective individual is almost forgotten. Our goal as therapists is how to rid them of this label and the imaginary mental disease it implies. When we research different therapeutic methods of intervention, we are similarly concerned with the reduction in psychological symptoms, which can be very different from treating underlying causes. In my opinion, modern-day therapists often become band-aid practitioners, whose methods include superficial gimmicks and a one-size-fits-all approach. This can be seen in the emergence of many manualized treatments that have been shown effective for reducing symptoms related to certain diagnostic labels. Symptom reduction, or alleviation, is the primary goal because, as a profession, we have seemingly forgotten that subjective symptoms have idiosyncratic causes that vary from person to person. We have taken a short list of subjective symptoms and turned them into a diagnostic objects, such as major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and so on. Potential consumers of psychological therapy have every reason to be suspicious of us. The psychological model has been overtaken by the big pharmaceutical model, unfortunately. Also note that we implicitly suggest that pathology lies within the individual person and presumably their brain, while our assumptions tend to ignore societal or cultural contributions to psychological distress. Furthermore, it seems to me that while we are taught to be culturally sensitive, we are not encouraged to question how culture can contribute to mental health or illness, and we especially avoid ways that our own culture may be at fault. We are implicitly encouraged to promote mainstream Western culture and ways of helping our clients fit within its fold. In my more cynical moments, I wonder whether I am truly expected to be working for the individual, or if I am supposed to be the working hand of our modern capitalistic culture, helping my client obtain their desire for a quick fix that will enable them to become, quote, successful and happy, as defined by mainstream societal expectations. I should mention that I do not think I do that, though that would seem to be the expectation that my profession has for me. Though we have the best intentions, I think that for all the reasons described, psychology as a field and profession has thus far failed to live up to its potential. We have so much more to offer our therapy clients and society in general. Most of the, quote, scientific research that we produce is pseudoscientific junk that will be seen as such in 5 to 10 years, when we will believe in some other ways of viewing human nature. I think that we can get past these issues, but would involve getting back to the basics by reintroducing philosophy and deductive reasoning into mainstream psychology. As Popper suggested, we need to be more open to criticizing and challenging our pet theories about what makes a human being. In this day and age, we need to let go of this insane medical model of mental illness and stop aspiring to become physicians or psychiatrists. We need to see how culture plays a larger role in mental illness and mental health. In short, we need to start advocating for the kind of psychology that our society needs and deserves. And, without beating a dead horse, think about this, right? You live in a society. We live in a society. You come home. Let's say you go work 8 hours a day at a gas station. There's nothing wrong with that. I honestly love gas station workers. They're honestly the real backbone of America. Truckers and gas station workers. Anyways, let's say you go to that shift. You come home, you eat a bunch of processed shit, and then you just watch shit on TV. And you repeat that. And all of a sudden you're like, man, this sucks. I want to kill myself. Or whatever. That is your body's way of saying, this is not right. You cannot continue to live like this. You need to fix this. So what can you do? I mean, there's nothing wrong with becoming a manager of your local gas station if you want to put up with all the bullshit they have to put up with, but you need to find yourself something that you like. Find a hobby. Find something that fulfills you aside from your work. And bro, I've been to psychologists and they tell you the same shit. I remember when I was in a session once and she was like, "What do you do for activity?" "I don't really do anything." "Well, maybe you should go for a walk." "I don't want to go for a walk." They give advice. Obviously the person has to be receptive to it though, right? But we also need to be mindful of what society, how that's impacting, like he was saying. So we live in a very difficult society right now in the United States. I mean, compared to the rest of the world, we're pretty well off, but cost of living is insane right now. All our public schools, if you actually think about putting your kids in public school, they're no good. Wages have stagnated. There's a lot of financial insecurity, and we've been bred into a culture where we think we just need to buy more and more stuff or get more things, consume more shit in order to feel better. And then when that doesn't work, and in our quieter moments, I guess, that's when we really can feel what's wrong. He also notes that we need to bring back philosophy into psychology. And this is where he has this article, "The Mind is Not Reduced to the Brain." Now, I'm not going to read through all of this because I've already read it. And I just wanted to kind of go into to end with what he's talking about. And so the mind and the brain are separate things. Now, he talks about how we have all these quote unquote great technologies like MRIs and things like that. But he notes the MRIs are not super accurate. And even if they are accurate, they're being fed into these theories of what this and this and this means. But on top of that, the areas of the brain that are quote unquote lighting up, well, what's causing the areas of the brain to light that up? Okay, the mind is not reduced to the brain. He also talks about genetic determinacy, which, yes, everybody is born with a unique genetic makeup. And he doesn't really talk about this, but I wanted to talk about it. Like, think about epigenetics, right? I myself grew up in a very Anglo society with a very Anglo family, and that rubbed off on me, stiff upper lip. Don't complain about your problems. No one really cares. That affected how I view the world. That affected how I treat others. And generation after generation, these have effects on your genetics. Let's say that someone says, well, depression runs in my family. Well, why don't we look at the underlying causes of that depression that runs in your family, so to speak? Oh, well, this family has been in a cult for the past 4 generations. And guess what cults do? They mentally destroy you, right? And so that would cause anyone to be depressed. You could say, well, alcoholism runs in my family. Well, you've got patterns of abuse, and you've got a society that encourages, even more so than social drinking, just a lot of drinking in general. What are you going to do about that, right? There is that level of genetic determinacy, but at the same time, you get to decide what you're going to do with that. I myself, I'm never going to be a 6'4" Chad with huge muscles, right? It's just not in my genes. Part of becoming an adult is coming to terms with how you're raised and how that affects you. So most of us were brought up in front of a TV, either that's video games, computers, whatever. And we're all very addicted to our screens. We always need podcasts to listen to, etc., etc., etc. So, and then also the way your parents treated you. So were they home all the time? Did you have a mom in the house? Were they both working? You need to come to terms with that. So part of becoming an adult is coming to terms with how you're raised and how that affects you currently. And B, it's also coming to terms with and accepting that you cannot change that. And there's nothing you can do. No kind of wishful thinking. What are you going to do with what you've been given? Are you going to utilize that to better yourself, to become more self-sufficient, to learn something? Or are you going to, which if you really want any kind of example of what it looks like when you just continually unhappy and you think life's not fair, you become, you join the alphabet people, where all of a sudden now you can have this social badge where everybody's going to treat you the way you quote unquote deserve to be treated, and you can put out all of your frustration onto other people undeserved most of the time because your life isn't the way you want it to be, right? So those are the two things about becoming an adult. It would appear that beneath the complexity of our interpersonal and sociocultural experiences, i.e., those related to morality, notions of free will, or what it means to be evil, are distributed neural networks that somehow represent those emergent mental experiences and their significance to us as individuals. The most important question, which we need to get right, is how did it get there? Unless you are an evolutionary psychologist, which even that's basically just been thrown out. If you go get an anthropology degree, no one takes evolutionary psychology seriously anymore. It makes sense that much of the time our psychological flexibility can be explained by our abundant neuroplasticity, not its being hardwired or innate. We might therefore question the assumptions of researchers that tend to minimize the brain's plasticity in favor of genetically determined explanations. Part of the problem lies in the fact that we have a methodologically objective science that wants to explain socioculturally shared subjective states, and that's really the best we can do, right? I mean, yes, there's transcendental arguments for God and, everything is in the mind of God or is an emanation for the mind of God. Yes, absolutely. But your lived reality is subjective. And so trying to apply any sort of objective, quote unquote, science is going to lead to problems. And it also explains the large problems we have with science being, quote unquote, objective. The brain belongs to the individual. The mind, however, does not. Well, not quite. The human mind is structured by language. Language is public. In some sense, then, the mind is itself public. In what sense? In the sense that what we know is embodied not just in our brains. In particular, the ascription of meaning is a social process, not an individual one. Symbols acquire meaning insofar as they are social symbols. But all is held together by what would seem to be faulty logic. When our methodologically reductionistic and objective science wants to explain some emergent and subjective phenomena, it will understandably run into problems. What commonly happens is either 1, a denial of the existence of the subjective phenomenon, such as some modern scientists claiming free will to be an illusion, or 2, an explanation of the subjective phenomenon as being caused by or identical to the physical mechanisms that our objective sciences can quantify. This is why we have people saying that depression is a brain disease. They claim to have found some underlying correlates representing the mechanism, but they mistakenly believe it to be the cause. And I hope you guys remember too, I think it was like 2 years ago, they did that huge meta-analysis, and it proved without a shadow of a doubt that depression is not caused by a chemical imbalance, right? There is a chemical imbalance in people with depressed brains, but what causes that chemical imbalance in the first place? Well, I hope this is obvious. Your immediate surroundings and society, right? We live in a very sick society in terms of any sort of tradition, moral virtue, appetite. There's issues there, right? And so if we're unable to break out of that in a way that we can find fulfillment to live a good life, you're going to be stuck on an endless cycle of pills. If you buy into the model of present-day psychology, you're going to be stuck on a cycle of endless pills, doctor visits. You're going to be a hell of a lot poorer, and you should probably spend that money, I don't know, invest it. Go fucking grow a garden. Go buy some fucking chickens and become a farmer. That money is, you're throwing money down the toilet every time you go to a psychologist. And there's the end of my psychology session. That will be $69.69. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you found its conclusions somewhat beneficial, and look forward to a Chud Psychological Research Center popping up in a location near you. God bless.